Across recorded history, a handful of organisms too small to see have killed more human beings than every army that ever marched. The Black Death, which erased a third of a continent in a single generation. Smallpox, which destroyed two civilizations the conquistadors could never have beaten on their own. The influenza of 1918, which in a single year killed more people than the whole of the First World War. And the one you lived through yourself, COVID. Each of them did more to reshape the world you live in than any king, any empire, any revolution ever taught in a classroom. We remember the wars, we build monuments to the generals, but history was written by the plagues. Here is the part we get wrong. We believe the freedoms we live by were built, earned by clever, determined people who fought for them. But the weekend, the right to walk away from a job, the very idea that ordinary work deserves a fair wage, trace each one back far enough, and you do not find a hero or a revolution. You find a disease. Again and again across 2,000 years, the catastrophes that emptied the world were the very same events that remade it. We did not build the world we live in. We survived into it. So whether you have come for the history, to follow a single thread of cause and consequence across 2,000 years of pestilence, or simply to let the story carry you off into the quiet of the night, settle in. This is the story of how the plagues made us. We have always counted the dead. We know the numbers, or we think we do. A third of Europe, half of a city, 9 in 10 of a people. We build the whole story of a plague around that figure, the great subtraction, the horror of how many were lost. But the number is not the story. The number is where most tellings stop, and where the real history has not yet begun. Because a plague does not end when the dying stops. That is the moment it starts to do its deepest work. The question this video asks is the one we almost never ask. Not how many died, but what the living did next. Consider what an empty space actually is. When a third of the people are suddenly gone, something strange happens to the ones who remain. The survivor who once competed with 10 others for a day's work now finds that his labor is scarce, and scarcity is power. The lord who once dictated terms must now plead for hands to bring in the harvest. For the first time in living memory, the person at the bottom can say no and walk away and be paid more to come back. This is the first pattern, and you will see it in every chapter that follows. A plague does not lower the survivors, it raises them. The catastrophe that empties a world hands unprecedented leverage to whoever is left standing in it. The second pattern is quieter, and in the long run it cuts deeper. Every society rests on someone who claims to understand the world and keep it safe. A priest, a king, a college of physicians, an institution that says, "Trust us, we know what to do." And every great plague arrives as a question that those people cannot answer. The prayers go unanswered, the remedies fail, the authorities are exposed, in the most public way imaginable, as men who did not know. Faith in God may survive. Faith in the institution that spoke for him does not fully, not the way it did before. The plague cracks the monopoly on meaning, and through that crack pours everything that comes after, which leads to the third pattern, the deepest of the three. After the prayers fail, and the experts fall silent, people do not simply return to believing what they believed before. They begin to believe someone else. The authority that could not save them is quietly set aside, and a new authority rises to take its place. A new faith, a new method, a new way of deciding what is true. The most profound thing a pandemic changes is not the economy and not the government. It is the answer to a single question. Who do you believe now? Power, faith, knowledge. Every plague in this story moves all three, and the world on the other side is never arranged the way it was. So here is the uncomfortable claim this video will spend the next 2 hours proving. We tend to think of progress as something we built, that the rights we hold, the wealth we enjoy, the freedoms we take for granted were won by clever and determined people pushing history forward. But again and again, across 2,000 years and 5 great pandemics, the evidence points somewhere stranger. The plague cleared the ground, and we built on what it left empty. It did not give us these things as a gift. The survivors had to seize them, fight for them, refuse to give them back. But the opening came from the catastrophe. Watch for the three patterns. They begin, as so much of our world does, in the ruins of the ancient one. To find where the pattern begins, we have to go back 1400 years, to a man who was trying to put the world back together. In the year 527, Justinian I took the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire in the great city of Constantinople. The Rome of the Caesars was already a memory in the West, its territories carved up by Germanic kingdoms. But Justinian would not accept that the empire was gone. He believed he could win it back, and for a time, astonishingly, it looked as though he would. His weapon was a general named Belisarius, perhaps the finest soldier of the age. In 533, Justinian sent him with a small force against the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, and within months the Vandals were shattered and Carthage was Roman again. Then came the harder prize. In 535, Belisarius crossed into Italy, took Sicily, seized Naples, occupied Rome itself. By 540, the Ostrogothic capital of Ravenna had fallen, and the heart of the old Western Empire was back under Roman command. The Mediterranean was on the verge of becoming, once again, a Roman lake. And then, in 541, something arrived that no general could fight. It came first to the Egyptian port of Pelusium, a hub where the grain ships gathered. From Egypt, it moved along the trade routes, and trade was the empire's lifeblood, which meant the empire's own arteries now carried its death. In the spring of 542, it reached Constantinople. It was bubonic plague, the same organism we now know that would one day become the Black Death. But no one had seen it before. It walked into the greatest city in the Christian world entirely unannounced. What followed in the capital was beyond the capacity of any authority to manage. The court historian Procopius, who was there, described the dying in numbers the mind refuses to hold. At its height, he claimed, 10,000 a day, though modern historians treat that figure with great caution. What is not in doubt is that the city was overwhelmed. The dead outpaced the living's ability to bury them. Bodies were stacked in the open, packed into towers along the walls, loaded onto ships and set adrift. A modern estimate suggests perhaps a fifth of the population of Constantinople died in that first visitation. The capital of the world had become a charnel house. Try to stand inside that city for a moment. Ordinary life simply stopped. The markets emptied, the courts fell silent, the workshops closed, and a strange and terrible quiet settled over streets that had been the busiest in the world. And running underneath the fear was a deeper bewilderment, because no one had any idea what this was. There was no notion of bacteria, no concept of contagion as we understand it. People watched their families die in agony from an enemy they could not see, name, or explain. The most sophisticated society on earth had been handed a question to which it had no answer at all, so they reached for the only explanation their world offered, that this was the hand of God. Our two great eyewitnesses tell us as much. Procopius, writing in the manner of the ancient historians, called it the greatest calamity that had ever befallen humankind, and confessed it could not be explained by human reason. John of Ephesus, a devout Christian bishop, was certain of the cause. The plague was divine punishment for the sins of mankind. Across the empire, people turned to processions, to fasting, to frantic prayer. When a disaster cannot be understood, every society in history has done the same thing. It searches for a meaning, and it searches for someone to blame. And then the unthinkable. The emperor himself fell ill. Justinian, the man rebuilding the Roman world, contracted the plague at the height of the epidemic. For a few days, in 542, it was an open question whether the empire would lose its head, and the court began quietly maneuvering for what would come after. He recovered. But consider what that moment revealed. The most powerful man on earth, brought to the edge of death by something he could not see, command, or comprehend. If the plague could do that to Justinian, the old certainties about who controlled the world had quietly come undone. He lived. The reconquest did not. Here we should be careful, because the honest historian admits the war in Italy was already grinding before the plague struck. Justinian underpaid his soldiers, starved a campaign of men, and his commanders quarreled. But the plague turned difficulty into impossibility. You cannot raise armies from villages that are empty. The manpower simply was not there. In Italy, the Goths, under a capable new king named Totila, revived and clawed back nearly everything Belisarius had won. What should have been a triumphant reunification dragged on for another bloody decade and ended in exhaustion. The deeper damage was to the foundation underneath the army, the treasury. An empire taxes people and land, and the plague had emptied both. Fields went uncultivated because the hands that worked them were dead. Rents went uncollected. Revenue collapsed at the precise moment Justinian needed it most, and the manpower shortage drove up the cost of whatever labor remained. There is the first pattern, in its earliest recorded form. The survivors' labor grew scarce and dear, and the empire that had depended on cheap, abundant subjects found the ground shifting beneath its feet. But watch what that scarcity did over the longer span, because here, the plague quietly rewired the foundations of society itself. The old Roman economy ran on slaves, abundant, cheap, owned. As the plague thinned that supply across the generations of its recurrence, landowners faced fields they could not work. And so a new arrangement emerged. Grant a plot of land to a nominally free labourer, a serf, in exchange for his service and a share of what he raised, and offer him protection in return. That bargain has a name. It is the seed of manorialism, the foundation of feudalism, the socio-economic skeleton of the entire medieval world to come. The plague did not just stall an empire, it began composing the Middle Ages. And the plague did not leave. It returned in waves for the next 2 centuries, roughly every generation, never letting the population fully recover before it struck again. Each return drained the empire a little further. The grand vision of a restored Rome quietly died, not on a battlefield, but in the arithmetic of depopulation. Justinian's successors inherited an overstretched realm they no longer had the people or the money to hold. This was not a single catastrophe, but a slow, recurring bleed across 200 years, and the Mediterranean world that had been whole began, piece by piece, to come apart. Now widen the view, because the plague did not respect borders. To the east lay the empire's great rival, Sasanian Persia, and the Persians sickened and died exactly as the Romans did. Both ancient superpowers were laid low together, locked in a stalemate neither now had the strength to break, both quietly hollowed out by the same invisible enemy across the same long century. They had been the 2 pillars holding up the political order of the entire Near East, and both were exhausted, depleted, running on empty, at very nearly the same time. This is where the first turning reaches its consequence. And here, the careful historian chooses words with precision. In the early 7th century, from the Arabian Peninsula, a new power emerged with extraordinary speed, united by a new faith. Within a few decades, the armies of Islam had conquered the whole of Persia and stripped the Roman Empire of Egypt, Syria, and the Levant. Historians debate the plague's exact role, and rightly. But many argue that the Arabs, drawing on populations the plague had touched less heavily, swept into a Near East, whose old empires had been worn to the bone by 2 centuries of recurring pestilence. We cannot say the plague caused the rise of Islam. History is never that simple, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling a certainty the evidence does not support. What we can say is that the world the Arabs conquered had been profoundly weakened, and that one of the great agents of that weakening was disease. The map of the modern Middle East, the religious geography of half the world, took shape in a landscape that the Plague of Justinian had helped to clear. The empires that might have resisted were already spent. Step back and look at what the plague left behind. The unified Mediterranean world of antiquity, one economy, one web of cities, one cultural sphere stretching from Spain to Syria, did not survive it. In its place rose 3 separate worlds that would grow ever more distinct, an Islamic one across the south and east, a Greek-Byzantine one at the center, and a Latin Christian one in the west. The shared classical world was gone, broken into the pieces from which medieval Europe, the Byzantine millennium, and the Islamic world would each be built. A single pandemic helped draw the borders of civilizations we still live beside today. And then, almost as a final insult, history forgot. Ask most people to name the pandemics that shaped the world, and they will reach for the Black Death, for 1918, for the one in living memory. Almost no one names Justinian, yet here, 14 centuries ago, the pattern runs its full course for the first time we can document: a depopulated empire, labor made scarce and powerful, an authority exposed as helpless before a question it could not answer, a political and religious order remade in the empty space. Everything that follows is a variation on what happened here. The wheel turned for the first time, and the world that came out the other side was not the one that went in. 8 centuries after Justinian, the wheel came round again, and this time it turned harder than it ever had before, or ever would again. To understand why the Black Death struck Europe with such annihilating force, you have to understand the Europe it struck. This was not a primitive, isolated world. It was the opposite. By the early 1300s, Europe was crowded, connected, and confident. Its population swollen to perhaps 80 million. Its cities linked by the busiest trade networks the continent had ever known. And that, precisely, was the trap. Here is the central, terrible irony of the Black Death, and you will see it return in every pandemic in this story. The very things that made medieval Europe prosperous, its trade routes, its bustling ports, its dense and interconnected cities, were the very things that made it defenseless. A plague needs movement to spread, and Europe had built, without knowing it, a perfect machine for moving death. The merchant galleys that carried silk and grain and silver would carry something else. Prosperity and vulnerability, it turns out, are often the same thing wearing different faces. There was another reason Europe was fragile, and it sat in people's bodies. A generation earlier, between 1315 and 1317, the continent had been ravaged by the Great Famine, years of relentless rain, failed harvests, and mass starvation that left survivors weakened and a population pressing hard against the limits of what the land could feed. Europe in the 1340s was overcrowded and underfed, living close to the edge. It was, in the coldest terms, dry tinder. All it needed was a spark, and the spark was already travelling west. The fire had been lit far away, on the dry grasslands of Central Asia, where the plague bacterium lived quietly among the rodents of the steppe. We now have genetic confirmation of this. The strain that devastated Europe traces back to a region near Lake Issyk-Kul, in modern Kyrgyzstan, where gravestones from the late 1330s record a sudden spike in deaths. From those grasslands the disease began to move, carried along the trade arteries that stitched Asia to Europe, travelling with the caravans, the merchants, and the rats that shadowed human commerce everywhere it went. By 1346, it had reached the Crimea, and a moment that has become legend. The Genoese maintained a trading port called Kaffa on the Black Sea, and it was under siege by a Mongol army of the Golden Horde, an army that was itself dying of plague. According to a contemporary account, the attackers loaded plague-stricken corpses into their catapults and hurled them over the walls. Whether this was truly the source, or whether infected rats simply crossed the siege lines, the result was the same. The defenders sickened, and the Genoese merchants did the one thing that would doom Europe. They fled home by sea. In October of 1347, 12 Genoese galleys limped into the harbour of Messina, in Sicily. What the dockworkers found aboard was a horror. Most of the crew were already dead. The few still living were covered in black, oozing swellings and burning with fever. The authorities ordered the ships back out of the harbour, but it was far too late. The rats had already come ashore. From that single port, on that autumn day, the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history began to pour into Europe. And it moved with shocking speed. From Sicily, it leapt to Genoa and Venice by the turn of the year, then raced up through the Italian peninsula. By the summer of 1348, it had struck France, Spain, and crossed the Channel into England. By 1349, it was sweeping through Germany and into Scandinavia. In a little over 3 years, it had reached nearly every corner of the continent. People had no frame of reference for a thing that moved so fast and killed so completely. It was as if the sky itself had turned against them. Part of why it spread faster than anyone could flee has to do with the forms the disease took, and here we will be clinical rather than lurid, because the medical reality is grim enough without dwelling on it. The most common form, bubonic plague, attacked the lymph nodes, producing the swellings that gave the disease its terror. But there was a second form, pneumonic plague, that settled in the lungs and spread directly from person to person through the air, with a cough. This airborne form needed no rats and no fleas. It simply passed from one breath to the next, which helps explain the impossible speed of its advance. Against this, the medicine of the age was utterly helpless, not because medieval physicians were fools, but because the very concept that could have saved them did not yet exist. There was no notion of bacteria, no germ theory, no understanding of contagion as we know it. The best minds of the 14th century, working with the knowledge they had, reached for the explanations their world offered. And those explanations, every one of them, were wrong. They blamed the air. The leading theory held that disease came from miasma, a corruption of the air itself, a poisonous vapor that hung over afflicted places. So people carried bundles of sweet herbs and flowers, lit fragrant fires, and held posies to their faces, trying to ward off a smell. They blamed the heavens, consulting the alignment of the planets, convinced the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars had poisoned the world. The University of Paris issued a formal report tracing the plague to the stars. Every explanation was sincere, sophisticated, and useless. And when the air and the stars offered no relief, people reached for the explanation that has always lurked beneath human catastrophe. This is a punishment, and someone is to blame. If God was angry, then sin had angered him. And if sin had angered him, then there must be sinners among us, hidden enemies, poisoners, agents of the disaster. The search for a cause curdled, as it so often has in history, into a search for a scapegoat, and medieval Europe knew exactly where it would point. The accusation that spread was monstrous and specific, that the Jews had caused the plague by poisoning the wells. It made no logical sense. Jewish communities were dying of the plague just as their neighbors were, but logic was not what the terrified crowds wanted. They wanted a face for their fear, and so, across the Rhineland and beyond, as the plague approached, a second wave of killing began, this one entirely man-made. It was one of the worst persecutions of medieval European history, and it was driven not by the disease itself, but by the panic the disease unleashed. The horror reached its peak in the city of Strasbourg. On the 14th of February 1349, around 2,000 Jews were burned to death on a wooden platform in their own cemetery. And here is the detail that exposes what was truly happening. The plague had not yet even reached Strasbourg. The community was destroyed in anticipation of a disease that had not arrived. Afterward, the records tell us, the cash the victims had owned was divided among the townspeople, and the debts that had been owed to them were simply cancelled. Beneath the religious panic ran a colder, more familiar motive. It was not only Strasbourg. In Basel, the Jewish community was burned, and a decree barred Jews from the city for 200 years. In Worms, hundreds chose death by their own hand over the mob. Across German-speaking Europe, town after town, the same scene repeated. And by the time it was spent, scholars count some 350 separate massacres, with dozens of Jewish communities erased entirely from the map. The Pope himself, Clement VI, condemned the killings and declared the accusations false. It made little difference. Fear, once it has found its target, does not listen to authority. Meanwhile, the ordinary machinery of life was simply grinding to a halt. As the plague entered a town, the markets emptied, the courts stopped sitting, the harvest stood unreaped in the fields because the hands that would have brought them in were sick, or fleeing, or dead. Trade collapsed. Workshops fell silent. A civilization that ran on the daily labor of millions discovered what happens when that labor suddenly, catastrophically stops. Whole regions slid toward a kind of paralysis no one had ever planned for or imagined. And the institution that was supposed to have the answers, the church, the very heart of medieval life, found itself in an impossible position. People did the natural thing. They turned to God. They crowded into churches. They begged the priests to intercede. But the prayers did not stop the dying. The processions did not turn the plague aside. The church had promised to stand between the people and the wrath of heaven, and now the wrath was here, and the church could not hold it back. A crack opened, quietly at first, between the faithful and the institution that claimed to speak for God. The crack widened as the priests themselves began to die. The clergy, by their calling, went to the bedsides of the sick to administer the last rites, and in doing so, they exposed themselves again and again to the disease. They died in enormous numbers, in many places faster than the population at large. The shepherds were falling with the flock, and when the experienced priests were gone, they were replaced, hastily, by whoever could be found, often poorly trained, sometimes barely literate. The spiritual authority of the church, in the space of a few years, was both decimated and diluted. Then came the abandonment, the slow, grief-haunting collapse of the bonds that hold a society together. The chroniclers describe it with disbelief. People fled the sick, even their own families. Parents abandoned children. Children abandoned parents. The dying were left alone because to approach them was to risk joining them. This was perhaps the deepest wound of all. Not the death itself, but what the fear of death did to the living, severing the most basic obligations of love and care that make a community a community. Let us go inside one city, because the abstractions of plague become real only when you stand in a single street. Take Florence, wealthy, sophisticated, one of the jewels of European civilization. When the plague came in 1348, it tore through the city with appalling speed. By the time it had passed, Florence had lost well over half its people. Some estimates run higher still. A city of well over 100,000 was reduced to a fraction of itself in a matter of months. The bustling heart of the Italian Renaissance to come became, for a season, a city of the dead. The writer Boccaccio lived through it, and his account is one of the most haunting we possess. He described bodies left in the streets because there was no one to carry them away, mass graves dug and filled in layers like lasagna, the social order dissolving as the dying overwhelmed every custom and ritual the city had built around death. People responded in opposite extremes, some shutting themselves away in isolation, others abandoning all restraint, eating, drinking, and taking whatever pleasure they could, in the conviction that tomorrow they would be dead. The city held a mirror to human nature, and what it showed was not simple. Try to grasp the sheer scale of what was happening across the continent, because the numbers strain belief. Modern estimates hold that the Black Death killed somewhere between 1/3 and 60% of all the people in Europe, a figure so large the human mind cannot really process it. Tens of millions dead in a span of years. Imagine 1/3 of everyone you have ever known gone within 3 summers. There is almost nothing in human experience to compare it to. It is, by proportion, very likely the greatest mortality event our species has ever endured. And behind the great number stood countless small ones, the villages. Across Europe, the plague did not merely thin populations, it erased entire settlements from existence. In England alone, the Black Death is reckoned to have depopulated or wiped out around 1,000 villages. Places with names and histories and churches and graveyards simply abandoned, left to be reclaimed by grass and forest. These are the empty villages, and I want you to hold that image, because in the chapter that follows, this emptiness becomes the most powerful force in the story. The absence itself will begin to reshape the world. Now consider what this did to the minds of the people who survived. They had watched the world end, not metaphorically, but in a way that must have felt entirely literal. They had seen 1/3 or more of everyone they knew die in agony. They had watched the church fail, the social order dissolve, the dead pile in the streets. A rupture like that does not simply heal when the dying stops. It leaves a generation marked, changed in how it sees God, authority, death, and the fragile order of ordinary life. The survivors carried the plague inside them long after their bodies were safe. That psychological rupture found desperate outward expression, and the most striking was the movement of the flagellants. Bands of men marched from town to town, stripping to the waist and whipping themselves bloody in public squares, performing a frantic, theatrical penance meant to turn aside the wrath of God. They were a symptom of a faith pushed past its breaking point. People so desperate to do something, anything, in the face of a power they could not touch, that they turned the violence on their own bodies. The institution had failed, so the people improvised their own terrible liturgy. But the flagellants carried a darker cargo than self-punishment. As they moved through the countryside, they whipped the crowds into religious frenzy, and that frenzy found the same target as before. The flagellant marches reignited the massacres of Jews, spreading the violence into new towns. What had begun as private penance became a public incitement to murder. It is a grim lesson in how fear behaves. Denied an enemy it can fight, it manufactures one it can, and the manufactured enemy is always the vulnerable neighbour, never the invisible disease. Step back and notice that the authorities, religious and civil alike, were largely helpless to stop any of it. Popes condemned the pogroms, some city councils tried to protect their Jewish communities, learned men issued their reports, and it all amounted to very little against the tide of panic. This is one of the quiet themes of every pandemic. The gap that opens between those who claim to be in charge and their actual power to control events. When that gap is exposed, in public for all to see, something fundamental shifts in how people regard authority itself. By around 1353, the first and worst wave finally began to recede, but it would be a mistake to think it simply ended. The Black Death was not a single event. It was the opening blow of a second plague pandemic that would haunt Europe for centuries, returning again and again, in 1361, in 1369, and on through the generations, with major outbreaks recurring into the 17th century and beyond. Each return struck a population that had not fully recovered. The plague did not visit Europe once. It moved in, and it stayed for 400 years. When the first wave lifted, it left behind a continent that scarcely resembled the one it had struck. The bodies had been buried, or burned, or simply left where they fell in the worst of it. The villages stood empty. The fields lay untended. A third or more of an entire civilization was gone, and the survivors stood blinking in a world that was suddenly, eerily underpopulated. Too few hands for the work, too few mouths for the harvest, too much empty space where the bustle of human life had been. The silence must have been the strangest part of all, and in that silence, almost no one could yet see what we can see looking back. They experienced the Black Death as pure catastrophe, as the end of things, an unmitigated horror with no meaning and no redemption. They had no way of knowing that they were standing not only in a graveyard but at a hinge of history, that the empty villages and the scarce hands and the cracked authority were not just wreckage, but the raw materials of a new world. To them, it was only loss. The transformation was invisible from inside it. Because here is the question that the catastrophe leaves hanging, the question that turns horror into history. A third of Europe is dead. The survivors stand in the ruins of everything they knew, and now they must do the one thing the dead cannot. They must go on living. They must decide what to plant, what to charge, what to demand, what to believe. What does a person do? What does a whole society do when it inherits a world with far too few people left in it? The answer to that question is where the modern world begins, and it begins in the next chapter. Stand again in the silence of 1353 and ask the question the catastrophe left hanging. A third of Europe is gone. The villages are empty, the fields untended, the survivors stunned. Now what? This is the moment that the conventional telling of the Black Death skips. It lingers on the dying and then falls silent, as if the story ended with the last grave. But the dying was only half of it. What the living did next is the half that built the modern world, and it begins with the strangest of inheritances: too few people and far too much of everything else. Consider the arithmetic of the empty world. Before the plague, Europe had too many people and too little to go around. Land was scarce, work was cheap, and a man at the bottom had no leverage at all, because there were always 10 others ready to take his place for less. The plague inverted that, violently and overnight. Now the land was plentiful and the people were few. The survivor who lived through the horror woke into a world where, for the first time in living memory, he was the scarce and precious thing. And scarcity, as every economy eventually learns, is power. The first place this showed was in wages. With so many labourers dead, the ones who remained found themselves suddenly, almost unimaginably, in demand. The chronicles of the time record it with a kind of scandalized astonishment. Workers who would not stir for the old pay, who turned up their noses at employment, who could scarcely be persuaded to serve unless for double or triple what they had earned before. A peasant could now look his lord in the eye and name his price. For the people at the very bottom of medieval society, this was a transformation without precedent. The world had been turned upside down, and it had turned in their favour. And the lords, the landowners, the men who had always held all the cards, they were the ones now pleading. A field of wheat does no good to anyone if there is no one to harvest it. The lord who could not find hands watched his crops rot in the ground and his revenues collapse. Desperate, many simply paid the higher wages because the alternative was ruin. Others tried to lure away their neighbours' workers with better offers, and a frantic competition for labour broke out among the very class that had spent centuries keeping labour cheap and bound. The masters were, suddenly and humiliatingly, the supplicants. The ruling class did exactly what ruling classes do when their position is threatened. They tried to make it illegal. In England, the response was swift and explicit. First came the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, then the famous Statute of Labourers in 1351. Laws that froze wages at their pre-plague levels, made it a crime to demand or to pay more, and forbade workers from leaving their villages in search of better terms. A labourer who left to seek higher pay could be arrested and branded. The law set a maximum wage for nearly every trade imaginable. It was a wall thrown up against the tide. And the wall did not hold. This is the crucial point, and it is the heart of the first pattern. You can pass a law against scarcity, but you cannot legislate people back into existence. The dead did not return to flood the labour market and drive wages back down. So the statutes were widely evaded. Employers quietly paid more in cash, or slipped workers extra food and grain that the law could not easily catch. Over the following century, despite all the legislation, farm wages in England roughly doubled. The market, driven by the empty villages, simply overpowered the will of the powerful. The leverage was real, and no statute could repeal it. But the survivors did not simply wait for the market to deliver, and this is important because the lazy version of this story makes it sound passive, as if wages just rose and freedom just arrived, gifts that fell from the sky. They did not. The serious history shows people acting, bargaining, walking off, refusing, pushing. And when the elite pushed back hard enough with their wage laws and their poll taxes, the people pushed back harder. The leverage created by the plague was the opportunity. What the survivors did with it was a choice, and sometimes that choice was open revolt. In England, that revolt came in 1381, the Great Peasants' Revolt. Inflamed by the wage laws, by a hated poll tax, and by the broader refusal of the elite to accept the new order, tens of thousands rose up in Kent and Essex and marched on London itself. Led by a man named Wat Tyler and a radical preacher named John Ball, they came with startling demands: the abolition of serfdom and the right to rent land freely. The revolt was put down and its leaders killed. But the message had been delivered, and it could not be unsent. The people at the bottom now knew their own strength. And here is what that strength achieved, slowly, across the generations that followed. The unraveling of serfdom itself. Serfdom, the system that bound a peasant to his lord's land, unfree, unable to leave, had been the bedrock of medieval society for centuries. But it could not survive a world where labor was scarce and mobile, and could simply walk away to a better offer. Why endure bondage when a free laborer down the road was earning double? Piece by piece, manor by manor, the old bondage dissolved. By the end of the 15th century, in England and much of Western Europe, serfdom had all but disappeared. So the first pattern completes itself in full. A catastrophe that killed a third of a continent did not, in the end, crush the survivors at the bottom. It raised them. It handed them scarcity, and scarcity gave them leverage, and leverage they turned, over a century of bargaining and revolt, into higher wages, greater freedom, and the end of the bondage that had defined their world. The weekend, the wage, the right to walk away from a job, the deep roots of all of them run back to this, to the empty villages and the bargaining power of the people the plague left alive. There was a material dividend, too, and it shows up in the bones. With a third of the mouths gone and the same land to feed those who remained, the survivors of the Black Death were, in a strictly physical sense, better off. There was more food per person, more land to go around, more meat in the diet. Studies of skeletons from before and after the plague suggest the post-plague population was actually healthier and longer lived than the one that came before. The 15th century became, for many ordinary Europeans, a genuine golden age of prosperity. Wages high, land plentiful, opportunity suddenly real. The catastrophe, against every expectation, had improved the lives of those who survived it. Now turn from the fields to the cathedral, because the plague was working a second transformation, quieter and in the long run more profound. The church had stood at the absolute center of medieval life, the keeper of meaning, the bridge between humanity and God, the institution that promised protection from exactly this kind of horror. And in the great test, it had failed. The prayers had not worked. The processions had not turned the plague aside. Millions had died with the church powerless to save a single one of them. That failure did not destroy people's faith in God, but it began, quietly, to corrode their faith in the institution that claimed to speak for him. Some questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. If the priests died of the plague exactly like everyone else, and they did, in enormous numbers, then what precisely was the special protection their office was supposed to confer? If the church could not save the faithful in their hour of greatest need, what was the church actually for? These were dangerous thoughts, and most people did not voice them aloud, but they were in the air now, a low and persistent doubt that had not been there before. The monopoly the church held on meaning had developed, for the first time, a visible crack. The crack was widened by a practical disaster. The clergy had been gutted, and what replaced them was thinner stuff. So many experienced priests had died at the bedsides of the sick, that the church scrambled to fill its ranks, ordaining replacements quickly, often poorly educated, sometimes barely able to perform the rites. The spiritual quality of the priesthood, in many places, visibly declined at the very moment its authority was already in question. A diminished, doubted church staffed increasingly by undertrained men was not the unassailable institution it had been a generation before. It was something more vulnerable, something that could, eventually, be challenged. And so the second pattern reaches its long consequence. We must be careful here, because the Reformation was more than a century away and had many causes the plague did not create. But the historians who trace its deep roots keep returning to this period, to the erosion of clerical authority, the new questioning, the quiet loss of the church's unchallengeable standing. When Martin Luther finally nailed his theses to the door in 1517, he struck at a church whose authority had been slowly weakening for generations. The plague did not cause the Reformation, but it helped open the long, deep fissure that the Reformation would eventually split wide. Now follow the third thread, the one that runs through invention, because the empty world did not only raise wages and shake the church, it changed what was worth building. When labor is cheap and abundant, there is little reason to invent a machine to do a man's work. The man is cheaper, but when labor becomes scarce and expensive, suddenly every labor-saving device is worth its weight in gold. The plague flipped that incentive across the whole economy. Scarcity of hands became a powerful, permanent reason to find ways of doing more with fewer of them. The empty villages were, quietly, an engine of innovation. You can see it in the workshops and the shipyards, where the pressure to economize on scarce labor drove new tools, new techniques, new ways of organizing work. The need to move goods efficiently with smaller crews spurred advances in shipbuilding and new business institutions to manage the risk. But the most world-changing example sits in a print shop in Mainz. For centuries, books had been copied by hand, letter by letter, by monks, the most labor-intensive process imaginable. The search for a faster, cheaper way to reproduce the written word was, at its heart, a search to save labor. And around the year 1450, that search produced Johannes Gutenberg's printing press. I want to be precise about this, because the connection is easy to overstate. The printing press was not caused by the Black Death in any simple way, and the Renaissance hunger for books that it fed had already begun before Gutenberg. But step back and see the pattern. A world remade by labor scarcity was a world hungry for ways to multiply human effort, and a machine that could produce in a day what a monk produced in a year was exactly that. The press let ideas travel as they never had before, cheaply, rapidly, in numbers. A depleted, questioning, increasingly literate Europe was suddenly handed the most powerful tool for spreading thought ever invented. And that is where the third pattern lives, in who Europe believed and how. The printing press shattered the old control over knowledge. Ideas the church might once have suppressed could now be copied faster than they could be banned. Luther's writings spread across Germany not because he was the first to criticize the church, but because he was the first to have a press amplify him. The authority over truth, which had rested with a small clerical elite who controlled the handwritten word, began to disperse outward into a reading public. The plague had cracked the old authority. The press helped decide who would inherit the power to say what was true. Meanwhile, the plague was also reshaping where wealth sat, and that had consequences no one intended. When a third of the population dies, inheritances concentrate. Estates that had been divided among many heirs now fell to few. Survivors, quite simply, inherited the wealth of the dead, and in many cases, fortunes pooled into fewer and richer hands. At the same time, the merchant and trading classes of the cities, nimble and liquid, found new opportunities in the reshuffled economy. A new concentration of wealth was forming, and concentrated wealth, in the right hands, does a very particular thing. It seeks to spend itself on beauty, and on status, and on art. This is the unexpected doorway into the Renaissance. We tend to imagine the Renaissance as a pure flowering of genius, a rebirth that arrived from nowhere on the wings of inspiration. But genius needs patrons, and patrons need money, and the money that funded the explosion of Renaissance art and learning was, in significant part, the wealth that the plague had concentrated. The Renaissance did not rise despite the Black Death. It rose, in part, out of the world the Black Death made, a world with fewer, richer men looking for ways to spend their fortunes and secure their names. Look no further than Florence, the city we watched die in the last chapter. The same Florence that lost more than half its people to the plague became, within a few generations, the beating heart of the Italian Renaissance. The merchant families who survived and prospered, names like the Medici, poured their concentrated wealth into art, architecture, and learning, hiring the painters and sculptors and architects whose work still defines the era. The city of the dead became the city of Botticelli and Michelangelo. The graveyard, given enough time, became the workshop of a new world. So picture, all at once, the continent the plague had remade. The fields worked now by free, well-paid labourers rather than bound serfs. The church standing but quietly diminished, its authority cracked. New machines multiplying human effort, ideas racing across the printed page, wealth pooling into the hands that would fund a cultural rebirth. Each of these is a thread, and every thread runs back to the same source. Not to anything the survivors built from nothing, but to the vast empty space the dead had left, and to what the living chose to do inside it. Return, then, to the motif that runs through this whole story, the question of where the power went. The Black Death did not destroy power, it transferred it. Power flowed from the lords toward the labourers, who could now bargain and walk away. It flowed from the church toward the secular and the questioning. It flowed from those who controlled the handwritten word toward a printing, reading public. Every great pandemic in this story moves power from one set of hands to another, and the Black Death moved it on a scale, and with a permanence, that reshaped the entire structure of European society. And return, too, to the deeper and more unsettling motif, the one that this whole series is quietly building toward. Everything in this chapter, every transformation, has a shape that you will see again. A connected world made vulnerable by its own connections. An authority that promised safety and was exposed as helpless. Conspiracy and the hunt for scapegoats. Labour upheaval and a fight over who would hold the new power. A society that lived through an unimaginable rupture and was permanently changed by it. The Black Death is the clearest, fullest version of the pattern, but it is a pattern, and patterns repeat. It is worth pausing to absorb how strange this all is, morally. There is something deeply uncomfortable about saying that the deadliest catastrophe in human history was, in its long consequences, a source of progress. We are not celebrating the plague. Tens of millions died in agony, and no improvement in wages or art can balance that ledger. But history is rarely tidy enough to let us keep horror and consequence in separate boxes. The same event that was an unmitigated tragedy for those who lived it was also, looking back, one of the great hinges on which the modern world turned. Both of these things are true at once. So let us state plainly what the Black Death actually built, when you add it all together. It broke the bondage of serfdom and raised the value of ordinary human labour. It cracked the unchallengeable authority of the medieval church and opened the road toward the Reformation. It rewarded the machines and the printed word that would carry Europe toward the modern age. And it concentrated the wealth that helped fund the Renaissance. The greatest mortality in human history was also, in its aftermath, one of the most powerful engines of transformation our species has ever experienced. And almost none of the people who lived through it could see any of this. That is the part worth holding on to. To the survivors, the Black Death was simply the worst thing that had ever happened. Pure loss, pure horror, with no silver lining visible from inside the storm. The transformation was only legible afterward, to those of us looking back across the centuries with the full pattern laid out before us. The people in the ruins experienced catastrophe. Only history could see the hinge. This gap, between how a pandemic feels to those inside it and what it turns out to mean, is something to remember. Because we have now watched the full cycle turn twice. Once with Justinian, in the deep past, where a depopulated empire saw its labour grow scarce, its authority falter, and a whole world order quietly rearranged. And now with the Black Death, in far sharper focus, where the same shape produced free labour, a cracked church, a printing revolution, and a renaissance. Two pandemics, separated by 8 centuries, running the same essential pattern: death, then leverage, then cracked authority, then a remade world. The repetition is the point. This is not coincidence. This is how it works. And if it is how it works, if this pattern is real and repeating, then the obvious question is how far it reaches. Does it hold only in Europe, only with this one organism, only in these particular centuries, or does the same terrible logic apply wherever a plague meets a population with no defense against it? To answer that, we have to leave Europe behind and cross an ocean that, for all of human history until this moment, had kept two halves of the world entirely apart. because the next time the pattern runs, it will not transform a civilization, it will erase one. For the whole of human history until the end of the 15th century, the world was, in one crucial sense, two worlds. The peoples of the Americas and the peoples of Europe, Asia, and Africa had developed in near total isolation from one another for thousands of years. And in that long separation, something invisible had been quietly accumulating, a difference not in intelligence or courage or civilization, but in the microscopic organisms each population carried in its blood. That difference, when the two worlds finally collided, would prove more decisive than any weapon ever forged. It would erase civilizations. Here is the root of it. For millennia, the peoples of Europe and Asia had lived crowded together with domesticated animals, cattle, pigs, fowl, and from those animals, generation after generation, had come a steady traffic of diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, brutal killers that swept through old world populations and, over centuries, left the survivors with hard-won immunity bred into them. The Americas had almost none of this. With few domesticated herd animals, the great crowd diseases had never taken hold. The peoples of the New World were, through no fault of their own, immunologically defenseless against an enemy they had never met. And these were not primitive peoples waiting to be discovered. When the Spanish arrived, the Americas held civilizations of staggering sophistication. In the Valley of Mexico stood the Aztec Empire, ruling millions, its capital a marvel. In the Andes stretched the Inca Empire, the largest state in the Western Hemisphere, bound together by thousands of miles of engineered roads. These were societies with monumental cities, complex economies, advanced astronomy, and standing armies that vastly outnumbered any European force that could be sent against them. By any reasonable measure, they should have been more than a match for a few hundred adventurers. So we have to confront the central question of the Spanish conquest honestly, because the popular story gets it badly wrong. How did a few hundred Spaniards, thousands of miles from home, overthrow empires of millions? The conventional answer credits steel swords, horses, guns, and the audacity of the conquistadors. Those things mattered at the margins. But they are not the answer. The answer, acknowledged even by the Spanish chroniclers themselves, is that the conquistadors had an ally that did more killing than all their weapons combined. That ally was disease. Begin with Mexico and with Hernán Cortés, who landed on the coast in 1519 with a few hundred men. Through a combination of audacity, alliances with peoples who resented Aztec rule, and sheer luck, he reached the great Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, a city built on a lake, larger and cleaner than most European cities of its day, home to perhaps 200,000 people. He took the Emperor Moctezuma captive, but the Aztecs rose against the Spanish and drove them out of the city in 1520, in a bloody retreat that should have been the end of Cortés. It was not, because something had come ashore with the Spanish that would do what their swords could not. The disease was smallpox, and it appears to have arrived with a later Spanish expedition, carried, by several accounts, by a single infected man. From that one introduction, it tore through the Aztec population with a virulence almost impossible to imagine, precisely because no one in the Americas had any immunity at all. A Spanish friar named Motolinia, who witnessed the aftermath, described the dead lying in heaps, so numerous that in many houses everyone perished and the homes were pulled down over the bodies to serve as graves. Where the Spanish weapons had killed in the hundreds, smallpox killed in the hundreds of thousands. And it did not kill randomly, it gutted the leadership. The disease swept away warriors and priests and nobles, and it killed the new emperor, Cuitlahuac, the very man who had successfully driven the Spanish out of Tenochtitlan, within months of his victory. The Aztec chain of command was shattered from the top down at the exact moment the empire most needed coordinated leadership. The Aztecs called 1520 the year of the pustules. When Cortés returned to besiege the city, he faced a population that was sick, leaderless, demoralized, and dying, not from anything he had done, but from an enemy no one could see. Tenochtitlan fell in August of 1521, after a brutal siege, but it is essential to understand what actually defeated it. The Spanish chroniclers knew. They recorded, with something close to wonder, that smallpox had done more to defeat the Aztecs than any musket or cavalry charge. A great city, a great empire of millions, was brought down not by the strength of its enemies but by the collapse of its own people, under a microscopic assault they had no way to comprehend or resist. The conquest that followed was, in a real sense, a mopping-up operation conducted in a graveyard. Now travel south, to the Andes, where the same terrible logic was about to repeat, and this time the disease ran ahead of the conquerors entirely. The Inca Empire was vast and powerful, ruled by an emperor named Huayna Capac at the height of its strength. And then, sometime around 1527, years before the Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro ever reached the heart of the empire, a wave of European disease swept down through the Andes. It had leapt ahead of the Spanish presence, passing from community to community far faster than any European could travel, racing into an empire that had not yet even met its conquerors. Here I must be careful with the evidence, because honesty demands it. In Mexico, the documentation that the killer was smallpox is rich and clear. In Peru, the sources are thinner and more contested. Some chronicles describe the disease differently, and serious scholars urge caution about naming it with certainty. What is not in serious doubt is the shape of what happened. A European disease, most likely smallpox, reached the Inca Empire ahead of the Spanish and struck it a devastating blow at the very top. And the man it killed was the emperor himself. Huayna Capac died of the disease, and so did the son he had named to succeed him, within a short span of one another. The most powerful empire in the Americas was suddenly left with no clear ruler and no settled means of choosing one. What followed was catastrophe, compounding catastrophe, a vicious civil war between two of the dead emperor's other sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, tearing the empire apart from within. The roads, the armies, the administration that held the vast realm together all turned against themselves in a struggle for a throne that disease had emptied. And it was into precisely this moment, an empire ravaged by disease, its leadership dead, its people divided and exhausted by civil war, that Francisco Pizarro arrived in 1532 with fewer than 200 men. He could not have toppled the Inca Empire at the height of its power. No one with 200 men could have, but he did not face the empire at its height. He faced its wreckage, a realm already broken by an invisible enemy that had arrived before him, killed its emperor, and set its people at one another's throats. The pattern at its most extreme, the plague did not assist the conquest. The plague was the conquest. Step back now and grasp the scale of what was unfolding across two entire continents, because it dwarfs even the Black Death. This was not one plague in one place. It was wave after wave of old-world disease, smallpox, then measles, then influenza, then more, crashing into a hemisphere of people with no immunity to any of it over decades. The estimates are almost beyond comprehension. By some reckonings, the indigenous population of the Americas fell by around 90% in the century and a half after contact, tens of millions of human beings. It may be the largest demographic catastrophe in the entire history of our species. The numbers from individual regions tell the story in miniature. Central Mexico, by some estimates, fell from around 25 million people before the conquest to barely more than 1 million within a century. Whole peoples vanished. Whole languages went silent. Across the Caribbean, some island populations were effectively annihilated, reduced to almost nothing within a generation of first contact. This was depopulation on a scale that turned bustling, cultivated, densely peopled lands into empty country. And that emptiness, as we are about to see, would itself reshape the world in ways no one intended. Because here is a consequence so vast it is almost difficult to believe, and it shows you the true magnitude of this event. So many tens of millions died, so much farmed and managed land was abandoned, that forests grew back across the Americas on a continental scale, and that regrowth pulled so much carbon out of the atmosphere that, according to a major scientific study, it measurably cooled the entire planet, contributing to the period of global cooling known as the Little Ice Age. Read that again. A pandemic killed so many people that it changed the climate of the Earth. There is no other event in human history of which that can be said. Now we reach the pattern, and we find it inverted in the cruelest possible way. In Justinian's empire, and in Black Death Europe, the catastrophe ultimately raised the survivors. Scarce labor became powerful. The people at the bottom gained leverage. Here, that did not happen, and the reason is the heart of this chapter's darkness. The dying was so near total, and it coincided with armed conquest by an outside power, that the survivors inherited nothing. The empty space they left was not filled by their own empowered descendants. It was claimed by the conquerors. The leverage that emptiness creates flowed not to the survivors, but to the people who had brought the disease. This is the first pattern turned inside out. A power transfer not within a society but between civilizations. One world inheriting the emptied space of another. The wealth of the Americas, the silver and the gold and above all the land, flowed across the Atlantic into European hands. That wealth helped fund the rise of Spain as the first global superpower and poured into the economy of the entire continent. The empty villages of the New World, unlike the empty villages of Europe, did not enrich the people who had survived the plague. They enriched the people who had, however unwittingly, unleashed it. And the emptiness demanded to be filled, which leads us to the most terrible consequence of all. And it must be spoken plainly. The conquerors had seized vast lands and rich mines, but the catastrophe had destroyed the very population they had intended to force into labor. They had inherited the land and lost the workers, and so they looked across another ocean for hands to replace the ones the disease had killed. The labor vacuum left by the Great Dying became one of the engines driving the transatlantic slave trade, the forced transport of millions of enslaved Africans to work the emptied Americas. Let that causal chain settle, because it is one of the darkest in all of history. A disease emptied 2 continents of their people. That emptiness created a demand for labor that could not be met locally, and that demand helped fuel the enslavement and forced migration of millions of human beings from Africa, a crime whose consequences still shape our world 5 centuries later. The plague did not just erase the civilizations of the Americas. It set in motion one of the greatest sustained atrocities in human history. There is no silver lining to be found here, only consequence, running dark and deep. The exchange ran in both directions in fairness, what historians call the Columbian Exchange. The Americas gave the world the potato, maize, the tomato, crops that would transform diets and fuel population growth across Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Old World sent back horses, wheat, cattle, but woven invisibly into that traffic of goods was the traffic of disease, and the disease moved almost entirely one way. The exchange of foods reshaped the world's kitchens. The exchange of pathogens reshaped the world's population, and it did so by emptying one hemisphere into the graveyard. Return to the motif of who people believe, because it operated here with shattering force. Imagine the catastrophe from inside an Aztec or an Inca mind. Your gods were supposed to protect you. Your priests, your rituals, the entire spiritual order of your world existed to keep the cosmos in balance. And now you are dying by the millions, while the strangers among you remain mysteriously untouched, seemingly immune to the wrath that is consuming your people. What does that do to a person's faith? The disease did not only kill bodies, it shattered the spiritual foundations of entire civilizations, and into that void poured the religion of the conquerors. This is part of why Christianity spread across the Americas as rapidly and completely as it did. It was not only the sword and the missionary, it was that the old gods appeared to have failed catastrophically, visibly, in the face of the disaster, while the god of the survivors, the immune strangers, appeared to have triumphed. A people whose entire understanding of the universe had just collapsed alongside 90% of their population were spiritually unmoored in a way few societies in history have ever been. The third pattern, the question of who you believe, was answered here at the barrel of a catastrophe. The demographic shadow of all this stretched for centuries, and in some places it never lifted. Native populations across the Americas did not begin to recover their numbers for generations, and many peoples were simply gone, erased so completely that we know them now only through archaeology and the records of the people who displaced them. The world we live in today, the entire shape of the modern Americas, with their populations descended overwhelmingly from European settlers and enslaved Africans, is the direct demographic legacy of this disease catastrophe. The map of the modern Western Hemisphere was drawn by a plague. And so we must sit, uncomfortably, with what the modern Americas are built upon. The United States, Mexico, Brazil, the nations of Central and South America, the prosperous, populous countries of the New World, exist in their current form because a pandemic emptied the land of the people who had lived there for thousands of years and made room for others. This is not a comfortable inheritance, and it should not be made comfortable. The foundation of one world was the graveyard of another. That is simply the historical truth, and it does no honor to anyone to look away from it. So consider how far the pattern has now bent. With Justinian, a plague redirected an empire. But with the Black Death, a plague transformed a civilization from within, and the survivors inherited a better world. But here, the pattern reaches its furthest and darkest extreme. Here, a plague did not redirect or transform a civilization. It replaced one set of civilizations with another entirely. The Aztec and the Inca worlds did not evolve through their catastrophe, as Europe did. They ended, and different worlds, built by different peoples, rose on the empty land they left behind. The lesson of the invisible conquest is the starkest in this whole story, and it is this: the most powerful actor in the meeting of these two worlds was not a king, or a general, or an army, or a faith. It was an organism too small to see, carried unknowingly across an ocean, against which an entire hemisphere had no defense. Everything we are taught about the age of conquest, the bravery, the strategy, the clash of cultures, sits atop that single biological fact. The conquistadors did not conquer the Americas. The diseases did, and the conquistadors inherited the ruins. Now the wheel turns again, and this time, it turns toward a discovery that would finally let humanity fight back. Every pandemic in this story so far has ended the same way, with humanity helpless. Justinian's physicians, the doctors of the Black Death, the healers of the Aztec and the Inca, all of them stood before the disease with no real understanding of what it was or how it moved, reaching for prayers and bad air and the alignment of the stars. For thousands of years, that was the human condition in the face of plague, to suffer and to guess. But in the 19th century, with a new disease and a new kind of city, something unprecedented finally happened. For the first time, humanity began to fight back, not with prayer, but with data. The new disease was cholera, and it was a creature of the modern age. It came out of the Indian subcontinent, and, riding the expanding trade and transport networks of the 19th century, spread across the world in a series of devastating pandemic waves. It found its perfect hunting ground in the one thing the era was producing faster than anything else: the industrial city. The factory towns of the 19th century were swelling with people far faster than anyone had built the infrastructure to support them. And that gap between how many people arrived and how they lived was where cholera thrived. Picture the industrial city at its worst. Hundreds of thousands of people crammed into crowded slums, with no proper sanitation, no clean water supply, no system for removing human waste. In London, the population had grown denser than modern Manhattan, and the River Thames had effectively become one vast open sewer, carrying the city's filth, and, unknowingly, its disease, directly past the points where people drew their drinking water. Cholera is a waterborne disease, It spreads through water contaminated with the waste of the infected. The industrial city, in its headlong growth, had built the perfect machine for delivering it. And the disease it delivered was terrifyingly swift. Cholera could take a healthy person in the morning and kill them by nightfall, through catastrophic dehydration, the skin turning a bluish tinge that earned it the name the Blue Death. It struck without warning and without apparent logic, felling some houses and sparing others, and to a population that did not understand how it spread, that randomness was part of the horror. Here, in the heart of the confident, industrializing 19th century, was a plague every bit as baffling as the ones that had terrified the medieval world. Because, and here the pattern repeats with almost wearying familiarity, the authorities did not understand it. The reigning theory of the age was miasma, the belief that disease was caused by bad air, by foul-smelling vapors rising from filth and decay. It was the same essential idea that had failed during the Black Death, 5 centuries earlier, dressed in 19th century clothing. Doctors, scientists, and government officials were nearly unanimous. Cholera came from the stink. They were wrong, and their wrongness was killing people by the tens of thousands. The explanatory authority of the age was, once again, failing the test. And once again, the failure had a familiar shadow, the search for someone to blame. As cholera swept through cities, suspicion fell on the poor, on immigrants, on outsiders. The same instinct that had pointed at the Jews in 1349 now pointed at the slums and the foreign-born. The pattern of scapegoating that we have traced through every previous chapter appeared here too, because it is one of the most reliable things human beings do under the pressure of an epidemic they cannot understand. Fear, denied a true cause, manufactures a human one. It is depressingly consistent across the centuries. But this time, in the middle of the 19th century, one man refused to accept the bad air explanation. His name was John Snow, a London physician, accomplished enough to have administered chloroform to Queen Victoria, who had become convinced, against the orthodoxy of his entire profession, that cholera was not spread through the air at all. He believed it was spread through water, water contaminated with the waste of the sick. He had argued this in print and been largely ignored. And then, in 1854, a savage outbreak erupted in the Soho district of London, and Snow saw his chance to prove it. What he did next is the birth of a science. Rather than theorize about vapors, Snow gathered data. He went into the stricken neighborhood and, case by case, death by death, he mapped it, marking on a street map of Soho exactly where each victim of the outbreak had lived. And as the map filled in, a pattern emerged that no theory of bad air could explain. The deaths clustered, tightly and unmistakably, around a single public water pump on Broad Street. The dead were not spread evenly, as a cloud of bad air would spread them. They were gathered around a source, and the source was water. Snow took his evidence to the local authorities and convinced them, against their skepticism, to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump, making it impossible to draw water there. And the outbreak subsided. Now, honesty compels a caveat that Snow himself acknowledged. The epidemic was probably already waning by the time the handle came off, so the famous gesture was as much symbol as cure, but the symbol was world-changing. Snow had not prayed, or fled, or blamed. He had collected information, found the pattern, identified the source, and acted on the evidence. He had treated a plague as a problem to be solved. This is the moment epidemiology is born, the science of how disease moves through populations, built on data, mapping, and the patient tracing of cause. Snow's map of the Broad Street outbreak is one of the founding documents of modern public health, and I want to be clear about its true significance, because it is the heart of this chapter. For the entire prior history of our species, a plague was a mystery endured. Snow demonstrated that it could instead be a puzzle investigated and understood. He handed humanity, for the first time, a weapon against pandemics that actually worked, the systematic analysis of evidence. Now consider what that map really was, looking back from our own time. It was the direct ancestor of every pandemic dashboard you watched during the most recent plague. Every map of case clusters, every chart tracing a disease through a population, every piece of data-driven public health that guided the world's response to the pandemic in living memory. All of it descends from a doctor walking the streets of Soho with a map, marking the dead. Snow invented the basic method by which modern humanity sees a pandemic. When the next plague came, a century and a half later, we fought it with the tools he forged here. But fighting a disease with data required something larger than one brilliant man with a map. It required the state to start counting its people, systematically, comprehensively, continuously, and that too was being built in this era. Governments began establishing systems to register every birth and every death, to record causes of mortality, to gather the raw statistical material that made it possible to see a pattern at all. In Britain, a statistician named William Farr at the General Register Office turned these death records into a powerful tool for tracking disease. The fight against the plague required and helped create the data-gathering state. Notice what is happening here, because it is the first pattern appearing in an entirely new form. In earlier plagues, the catastrophe handed power to the surviving labourers. Here, the catastrophe handed power and a new mandate to the state itself. To fight cholera, governments had to measure their populations as never before, to inspect, to count, to know. The modern public health apparatus, boards of health, registries, the systematic surveillance of a population's well-being, was forged in response to the 19th century plagues. The disease did not empower the worker, it empowered the bureaucracy that would watch over him. And that is a double-edged inheritance, which is worth naming honestly. The same capacity that lets a state track a disease and save lives also lets it monitor, count, and surveil its citizens in ways that had never before been possible. The machinery of public health is, unavoidably, machinery of observation. When you build a state that can map every death and trace every outbreak, you have also built a state that can see its people with unprecedented clarity. The benefits are immense, but so is the power, and the 19th century plagues are where modern humanity first granted the state that intimate, watchful authority over the body. The other great response was to rebuild the city itself, and here the story contains a delicious irony. London finally resolved to fix its sewage not because it accepted Snow's water theory, but because of the Great Stink of 1858, when a hot summer made the reek of the Thames so unbearable that Parliament, sitting right beside the river, could no longer function. The lawmakers acted to banish a smell. They still half believed in miasma. But the magnificent sewer system they commissioned, engineered by Joseph Bazalgette, worked anyway, because removing the filth from the water was exactly the right thing to do. They did the right thing for the wrong reason, and it saved untold lives. Bazalgette's sewers, and the great sanitation projects that followed across the industrial world, were monuments to a new idea, that a society could engineer its way out of plague by reshaping the physical environment that disease depended on. Clean water in, waste safely out. The unglamorous infrastructure that, more than any medicine, would tame the epidemic diseases of the crowded city. When London suffered its final major cholera outbreak in 1866, the deaths fell overwhelmingly in the one district not yet connected to the new sewers. The proof was complete. The waterworks had done what prayer and bad air theory never could. So the third pattern, the question of who you believe, turns here in a profound direction. For most of human history, the authority over plague had belonged to priests and the explanations of religion. Now, it shifted decisively towards science, data, and the statistical method. Cholera was defeated not by faith but by evidence, by a map, a pump handle, a sewer, a table of mortality figures. The deepest legacy of the 19th century plagues is this transfer of trust, from the divine to the empirical, from the sacred explanation to the scientific one. It is a shift we still live inside, and one that the most recent plague would test severely. And here is the quiet triumph of this chapter. the inheritance you never think about. When you drink a glass of water without fear, when you flush a toilet, when you trust that your city's invisible infrastructure is keeping cholera and typhoid away from your family, you are living inside the victory won here, in the 19th century, against the Blue Death. The plague that built the modern state also built the modern city's plumbing and the modern science of how disease moves. Cholera taught humanity that a pandemic could be understood, mapped, and engineered against. It was the plague that, at last, taught us to fight back, and the next plague would test everything we had learned. By the early 20th century, humanity had every reason to believe it had finally escaped the age of plague. The lessons of cholera had been learned. Cities had clean water and sewers. The germ theory of disease was understood at last. Scientists now knew that tiny organisms caused illness, and could even see some of them. Vaccines existed. Public health was a science. The terrors that had haunted Justinian and medieval Florence seemed like relics of a darker, more ignorant age. Modern scientific civilization had, surely, put the great pandemics behind it forever. And then, in 1918, that confidence met the deadliest single pandemic year in human history. It arrived in the middle of a war, the First World War, and the two catastrophes would feed each other in terrible ways. The conditions of the war were almost perfectly designed to breed and spread a new disease. Millions of young men packed into crowded camps and trenches, living in filth and exhaustion, then shuttled across the world by troopship and railway in numbers, and at speeds no army had ever moved before. The war assembled the kindling and lit the match. A novel strain of influenza, against which no one had immunity, emerged into the most efficient human mixing and transport machine ever built. Where exactly it began is still debated, and honesty requires admitting the uncertainty. The leading candidate is rural Haskell County, Kansas, where a local doctor named Loring Minor saw, in early 1918, an influenza so severe and so strange, striking down strong, healthy adults, that he formally warned the United States Public Health Service. Young men from that county carried it to a nearby army camp, Camp Funston, packed with tens of thousands of soldiers bound for Europe. From there it traveled with the troops across America and across the Atlantic. But the origin is contested, and what matters more is what the disease did once the war set it loose upon the world. The first wave, in the spring of 1918, was relatively mild, a bad flu, but not obviously the harbinger of catastrophe. And then the war hid what was coming, because here, the pattern of every pandemic, the failure of authority, took a very particular and modern form: deliberate censorship. The warring nations, Britain, France, Germany, the United States, suppressed news of the spreading illness, terrified that reports of mass sickness would damage morale and reveal weakness to the enemy. To protect the war effort, governments chose to keep their own people in the dark about a gathering plague. This censorship is the reason for one of history's great misnomers. The disease did not originate in Spain, but Spain was neutral in the war, and its press was free, and so Spanish newspapers reported openly on the epidemic, including the news that the Spanish king himself had fallen ill. To the rest of the world, reading only the uncensored Spanish coverage while their own papers stayed silent, it looked as though Spain was the epicenter. The name stuck, the Spanish flu. As one historian put it, it was called the Spanish flu simply because the Spanish media did their job. The label itself is a monument to the failure of everyone else's honesty. Then, in the autumn of 1918, came the second wave, and it was a horror almost beyond reckoning. The virus had mutated into something far deadlier, and it now killed with appalling speed and cruelty. Victims could be well in the morning and dead by night, their lungs filling with fluid until they suffocated, their skin turning a dark blue-purple from lack of oxygen. The dying was so swift and so widespread that cities ran out of coffins, out of gravediggers, out of space. In the span of a few months, this second wave did the overwhelming majority of the pandemic's killing. And then there was the matter of who it killed, which terrified people most of all because it made no sense. A normal influenza takes the very young and the very old, the weak. This one did something almost unheard of. It killed healthy adults in the prime of life, people in their 20s and 30s, the strongest members of society. Graphed out, the death rate by age formed a shape epidemiologists had never seen for flu, a W, with a monstrous extra peak right in the middle, among the young and vigorous. The leading explanation is grimly ironic. A strong, healthy immune system may have overreacted to the virus so violently that it destroyed the very lungs it was trying to protect. Grasp the scale, because it dwarfs the war that was raging alongside it. The 1918 influenza infected perhaps a third of the entire human race, around 500 million people. The death toll is estimated at somewhere around 50 million, and possibly far higher. To set that against the war it accompanied, the First World War, one of the bloodiest conflicts in history, killed somewhere around 17 million. The flu killed roughly 3 times as many. The greatest slaughter of those years was not the machine guns and the artillery, it was the virus, and yet it is the war we remember. In the United States alone, around 675,000 people died, a number that exceeded the total American combat deaths of the First World War, the Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam combined. More American soldiers in the war died of the flu than were killed by the enemy. The disease was woven right through the conflict. Even President Woodrow Wilson contracted it, falling gravely ill during the Paris peace negotiations in 1919, though his administration, true to the era, hid the truth and told the public he had merely caught a cold from the Paris rain. Now we arrive at the part of this story that should make a modern viewer sit up, because 1918 was a complete dress rehearsal for the pandemic in living memory, every feature of it. As the disease spread, cities reached for the only tools they had, the same non-pharmaceutical tools we would reach for a century later, closing schools, churches, theatres and saloons, banning public gatherings, isolating the sick, and ordering people to wear masks. There were no antibiotics, no antivirals, no flu vaccine. The medicine of 1918, for all its modern confidence, was reduced to exactly the measures our own grandparents' grandparents had used: distance and cloth over the face. And here, history performed a near-perfect controlled experiment, one that speaks directly across the century. 2 American cities, Philadelphia and St. Louis, faced the second wave at almost the same moment and chose opposite paths. Philadelphia, despite warnings that the flu was already spreading, went ahead with a massive parade in late September that drew some 200,000 people into the streets. St. Louis, by contrast, moved quickly and aggressively to close public gathering places and impose distancing over the objections of local businesses. The 2 cities were a natural experiment in how to respond to a plague, and the results were stark. In Philadelphia, the parade was, in the words of one account, like throwing gasoline on a fire. Within days, the hospitals were overwhelmed. Within weeks, thousands were dead. The bodies piled up faster than the city could bury them. In St. Louis, where leaders had acted early and decisively, the death rate at its peak was a fraction of Philadelphia's, by some measures around 1/8. A later scientific analysis confirmed the lesson across many cities. Those that intervened earlier and more aggressively suffered significantly lower peaks of death. The evidence was written in tens of thousands of lives. Acting early and closing things down saved people. If that sounds eerily familiar, the closures, the parade that became a super spreader, the fights between public health officials and business owners, the proof that early action saved lives, it should. Every argument we had during the most recent pandemic, every debate over masks and closures and the cost of caution, was rehearsed here in 1918 in almost identical terms. The masks came with resistance and grumbling and even organized opposition, exactly as they would a century later. We treated our own pandemic as something unprecedented. It was not. It was a rerun, and the script had been written 100 years before. The pattern of scapegoating appeared here too, as it always does. The disease's very name was an act of blame. pinning a global catastrophe on a single nation that happened to report it honestly. Conspiracy theories flourished, that the flu was a German biological weapon, that it had been spread deliberately by enemy agents. Faced with a terrifying disease they did not fully understand, people did what people in every chapter of this story have done. They looked for a human enemy to hold responsible, because a human enemy is something you can hate, and hating feels better than fear. And the confident modern medicine of the age, the medicine that had believed it was conquering disease, confronted its limits and could not save them. Doctors understood germ theory now. They knew this was an infectious agent, but knowing did not mean curing. They could not see the virus with the microscopes of the day, could not treat it, could not stop it. The great promise of scientific medicine, that humanity was finally mastering the microbial world, was exposed as premature in the most brutal way. The plague had returned to a civilization certain it was immune, and that civilization's science stood nearly as helpless as the priests of 1348. So the second pattern, the cracking of authority, operated here in a subtle modern key. It was not the church that failed this time. It was the twin authorities of the age, government and scientific medicine. Governments had lied to their people through censorship. Medicine had promised mastery it could not deliver. The faith of the early 20th century in progress, in expertise, in the steady conquest of nature by science, took a quiet wound in 1918. It would be papered over and largely forgotten, but the crack was there. A first faint loss of confidence in the modern authorities that claimed to keep people safe. There was a second wave, and then a third over the winter of 1918 and into 1919, as demobilizing soldiers carried the disease home to communities everywhere. And then, having killed tens of millions, the pandemic simply faded. The virus burned through the available population, and the wave subsided, and the disease receded into the background. There was no triumphant cure, no moment of victory. It ended the way these things often do, not with a defeat administered by humanity, but with the disease running out of fuel. The deadliest pandemic year in human history concluded in something like anticlimax. And then comes the strangest part of the whole story, the part that gives this chapter its name. Humanity forgot. A pandemic that killed 50 million people, 3 times the toll of the World War, vanished from public memory with astonishing speed. It produced no great monuments, few novels, little of the cultural processing that the war received in abundance. For decades it was barely taught, barely discussed, a near blank in the collective memory of the 20th century. The single deadliest pandemic in modern history became known, aptly, as the forgotten pandemic, and that forgetting is itself worth understanding. Why did we forget? Part of it was the war, which absorbed all the era's grief and attention and meaning. The flu was overshadowed by the slaughter it accompanied. Part of it was the sheer desire to move on, to put the horror of those years behind, and step into the hopeful 1920s. And part of it, one historian suggests, was a kind of shame, that dying of the flu in a hospital bed was seen as somehow unheroic, even unmanly, next to dying in battle, so that families and societies made a quiet, collective decision not to dwell on it. The greatest plague of the modern age was, in a sense, deliberately set aside. This forgetting is the deepest link in our whole story, because it reveals the most consistent human weakness in the face of plague. We do not learn. Every generation believes its pandemic is unprecedented. The people of 1918 had largely forgotten the cholera lessons of the century before. We, in our turn, had thoroughly forgotten 1918. The masks, the closures, the censorship, the scapegoating, the natural experiments in distancing, all of it was there, documented, available, and almost entirely unremembered when we needed it most. The amnesia is the pattern. We are doomed to be surprised by the thing that has happened over and over before. There was a flicker of the first pattern here too, though muted. The loss of so many young workers did create, briefly, the familiar pressure, labour made scarcer, survivors with marginally more leverage. But unlike the Black Death, the effect was modest and quickly swamped by the enormous economic forces of the post-war world and the demographic recovery that followed. The 1918 flu did not reshape the labour market the way the medieval plague had. Its great legacy was not economic transformation. It was something else, a warning delivered and then ignored, and a rehearsal of every mistake we would make again. Because the deepest significance of 1918, looking back from where we now stand, is that it was the bridge between the ancient pattern and the modern one, the last great pandemic before the one we ourselves would live through. Everything in it points forward to our own time. The global disease spread by global connection, the closures and the masks, the official lies and the conspiracy theories, the confident science caught flat-footed, and above all the forgetting that left us unprepared. 1918 is the rehearsal. What it rehearsed was the play we would all be cast in 100 years later. And the cruelest irony is that the very modernity which was supposed to protect them was part of what doomed them. The speed of modern transport spread the disease faster than ever before. The density of modern cities concentrated it. The scale of modern war bred it and broadcast it. Each advance that made the world feel safer and more connected was, to the virus, simply a better delivery system. This is the paradox of connection again. The same lesson the Black Death taught when it rode the trade routes, returned in industrial, 20th century form. The more connected we become, the more efficiently a plague can travel through us. So the wheel had turned once more, in living memories near reach, and humanity had looked away almost before the dying stopped. The lesson sat in the archives, fully recorded and almost entirely unlearned, waiting. For most of a century, the forgotten pandemic stayed forgotten, a warning no one was reading. And then, 100 years on, in a world more connected than 1918 could have dreamed, the wheel began to turn again. And this time, it would turn for us. We had seen all of this before. We had simply chosen not to remember. And so, when it came as if it had never happened at all. And so we arrive at the present, or near enough to it that you do not need a historian to tell you what happened, because you were there. Everything we have traced across 2,000 years, from Justinian's Constantinople to the trenches of 1918, was building toward a single recognition that the pattern is not finished, that it did not end with our grandparents, that it came round again in our own time. You lived through the latest turn of the wheel, and what I want to do in this chapter is simply hold the pattern up against your own memory and let you see how exactly the present rhymes with everything that came before. Begin where every chapter has begun, with connection and the vulnerability it brings. The Black Death rode the medieval trade routes. 1918 rode the troopships and railways of a world at war. The most recent pandemic rode something faster than either. The jet aircraft, the globalized economy, a world stitched together so tightly that a virus emerging in one city could reach every continent in a matter of weeks. The paradox of connection, the oldest lesson in this story, returned in its most extreme form yet. The very networks that made the modern world prosperous and close made it, once again, defenseless. The faster we move, the faster the plague moves with us. And then the cities sealed themselves, exactly as Justinian's Constantinople had, exactly as Florence had in 1348. Across the modern world, the great metropolises fell silent. Shops shuttered, streets emptied, populations confined to their homes. You remember it, the strange quiet, the closed doors, the deserted public squares. We had a new word for it, lockdown, but the thing itself was ancient. The image of the sealed, frightened city, which has appeared in every single chapter of this story, appeared once more, this time captured not in a chronicle but in your own memory, and broadcast live to every screen on Earth. Let us be clear about the scale, with the honesty this subject demands. The official global death toll stands at around 7 million, but the true figure, measured by how many more people died than would have in normal times, is certainly far higher, by the estimates of major health bodies, likely 2 or 3 times that, many millions of lives. And as with every plague, the burden fell unevenly. Where 1918 had struck down the young and healthy, this disease fell hardest upon the old. It was, by any measure, one of the deadliest pandemics in a century, a catastrophe on the scale this whole story has been describing. Now watch the first pattern appear, the one about labour and leverage that we traced from Justinian's empty fields to the end of serfdom. When the pandemic confined workers to their homes, it triggered the largest, fastest change in how human beings work since the Industrial Revolution. Overnight, vast numbers of people stopped commuting to offices and began working from their homes. And here is the echo of the empty villages. When the immediate danger passed, many workers discovered they now had leverage they had never possessed before. They could refuse the old arrangement. They could demand flexibility, or better pay, or simply walk away. The scarcity of labour, once again, shifted a measure of power toward the worker. That shift has proven durable, not temporary, which is exactly what the pattern predicts. Years after the lockdowns ended, remote and hybrid work has settled into what economists call a new equilibrium, a permanent feature of the modern economy rather than a passing emergency measure. The empty office, like the empty village, turned out to be a doorway to a lasting change in the relationship between labour and power. We are not talking about wages and serfs this time, but the deep logic is identical. A plague emptied the workplaces, and in that emptiness, the people who do the work found a new ability to set their own terms. The same disruption reshaped something larger still, the supply chains that bind the world together. When the pandemic shut factories and ports, the long, intricate, globe-spanning systems that deliver goods simply broke. Shelves went empty. The just-in-time efficiency that had defined the global economy was revealed as dangerous fragility. And the response has been a slow, deliberate turn, what is called reshoring, the bringing of production back closer to home, a retreat from total globalization in the name of resilience. The plague forced a rethinking of how the entire world economy is structured, and that rethinking is still unfolding around us today. Now the darker patterns, beginning with the one that has appeared in every chapter without exception, the search for someone to blame. As the disease spread, the old instinct ignited again. There was a surge of hostility directed at people of Asian descent, scapegoated for a virus they had nothing to do with. The same ancient reflex that burned the Jewish communities of Strasbourg in 1349, dressed in modern clothing. Fear, denied a target it can fight, manufactures a human enemy. 7 centuries of supposed progress had not changed this most basic and ugly of human responses to a plague. We did exactly what the medieval mob did, and alongside the scapegoating came the conspiracies, exactly as they came in 1348 and in 1918. The disease was a deliberate weapon. The cure was the real poison. Hidden powers were orchestrating events for their own ends. The specific theories were new, shaped by the internet, but their shape was utterly ancient, the same desperate attempt to find an intelligible human design behind a frightening and impersonal catastrophe. Whether any particular claim held truth or not, the deeper phenomenon was the pattern itself. A frightened population, unable to accept that a thing this large could have no author, reaching for a story in which someone, somewhere, was in control. This brings us to the genuine, unresolved question of the disease's origin, which I will treat with the honesty it deserves and no more. To this day, there is real and legitimate debate about how the pandemic began, whether it emerged naturally from animals, as most pandemics in this story did, or escaped from a laboratory. That question is not settled, and serious, honest people hold different views. I am not here to answer it. I raise it only to note how perfectly it fits the pattern. Every great plague, from the Plague of Justinian onward, has been haunted by uncertainty and dispute about where it truly came from. The mystery of origins is itself part of the recurring story. Now the masks and the closures, and here the rhyme with the past is so exact, it should make the hair stand up. Every argument we had, our societies had already had, word for word, in 1918. The mask mandates and the resistance to them, the closures and the businesses that fought them, the fierce dispute over whether the cure was worse than the disease. Recall Philadelphia and St. Louis, the parade and the early closures, the eightfold difference in the dead. We reran that exact experiment on a global scale with the same fault lines and the same fury, almost entirely unaware that our great-grandparents had run it before us and left us the results. And the second pattern, the cracking of authority, operated with tremendous force, but in our time, it struck a distinctly modern target. It was not the church whose authority fractured, as in 1348. It was the authority of expertise itself, of public health institutions, of scientific officials, of the entire apparatus of credentialed knowledge that the modern world relies upon. As guidance shifted and predictions failed and officials contradicted themselves and one another, trust in those institutions eroded, measurably and significantly, across many nations. Whether that erosion was deserved is a question people will debate for a generation. That it happened is not in doubt. Sit with how deep that runs, because it is the most consequential legacy of this plague, and it is the third pattern in its fullest form. Recall what happened after 1348. The failure of the Church to stop the dying cracked its monopoly on meaning, and that crack ran for centuries, all the way to the Reformation. Something structurally similar may be happening in our own time to the authority of expertise. The faith that modern people placed in institutions, in experts, in the official keepers of truth, took a wound during the pandemic that has not healed. The question of who you believe, the deepest question any plague raises, was thrown wide open, and it remains open today. But the pattern is never only loss, and the crisis forced real creation, as crises do. Faced with the disease, science achieved something genuinely unprecedented: the development of effective vaccines against a brand new virus in a fraction of the time such a thing had ever taken before. Whatever one's view of all that followed, the raw scientific accomplishment was staggering, a feat that would have been impossible in any previous pandemic in this entire story. The plague, as plagues do, accelerated. It compressed years of normal progress into months, and pushed forward technologies and capabilities that will outlast the disease that summoned them. And the surveillance state took another great leap, exactly as it had with cholera. Recall Jon Snow's map and the birth of the data-gathering state in the 19th century. Now recall the dashboards, the live maps of cases and deaths, updated by the hour, that the whole world watched during the pandemic. That was Jon Snow's Broad Street map, scaled to the entire planet and refreshed in real time. The capacity of states to track, count, and monitor their populations expanded dramatically, with all the benefits and all the dangers that double-edged inheritance has always carried. The plague once again handed the watching state new power over the individual body. So look at what you have just seen. The connected world made vulnerable by its connections, the sealed and silent cities, labor finding new leverage and remaking how we work, supply chains broken and rebuilt, the scapegoating, the conspiracies, the masks, the closures, the authority of the experts cracked and trust thrown into question, the forced acceleration of technology and the further rise of the watching state. Every single thread this story has traced across 2,000 years ran again, in your lifetime, in front of your eyes. You did not just live through a pandemic, you lived through the latest turn of a wheel that has been turning since Justinian, and now you have seen its shape. So we come to the end, and the pattern stands revealed in full. 5 great plagues, across 2,000 years: Justinian's, the Black Death, the smallpox that emptied the Americas, the cholera of the industrial city, the influenza of 1918, and a 6th in living memory. 6 different organisms, 6 different worlds, 6 different centuries. And in every single one, the same shape: a connected society made vulnerable by its connections, an authority that promised safety and was exposed as helpless, the hunt for someone to blame, and, in the empty space the dead left behind, a profound and lasting transformation of how people lived, worked, worshipped, and decided what was true. This is not coincidence. It is the closest thing to a law that human history offers. And so we return to the claim we began with, the one that sounded at the start like a provocation. We said that the dead did not change the world, the survivors did. Now you have seen what that means. The plague was never the author of the new world. It was only the force that cleared the ground. What rose in the empty space was built by the living, by the peasants who refused the old bondage, by the thinkers who questioned a church that had failed, by the doctors who chose to map a disease instead of fearing it, by every generation that took the catastrophe handed to it and made something out of the ruins. The plague provided the opening. The survivors decided what to do with it, which forces us, finally, to look honestly at the freedoms and the comforts of our own lives and to see how much of what we take for granted was inherited from catastrophe rather than built from genius. The value of an ordinary person's labor, traceable to empty medieval villages. The questioning, secular cast of the modern mind, traceable to a church that could not stop the dying. The clean water and the science of public health, traceable to the blue death in the industrial slum. The very shape of the modern world. We did not, in the comfortable story we tell ourselves, simply build all of this through our own cleverness. To a degree that should humble us, we survived into it. The world we live in was, in no small part, made by the plagues. And if the pattern is real, if it has held for 2,000 years, through 6 pandemics and 6 transformations, then it carries one more lesson, the hardest of all. The wheel will turn again. This is not pessimism. It is the nearly unanimous judgment of the people who study these things, who tell us that another pandemic is not a question of whether, but of when. And here, the oldest motif in our story, the forgetting, returns with a terrible immediacy. For we are already doing it, already, in the years since the last plague, withdrawing the resources and the attention, sliding back into the same cycle of panic and neglect that left us unprepared every time before. We have always forgotten. We are forgetting now. But you, having watched the wheel turn 6 times, do not have to forget. That is the one thing this long history can give you. Not comfort, but clarity. The ability to recognize the shape when it comes again. To know that the fear and the blame and the cracking of authority are not new. To understand that what comes after will be decided not by the disease, but by what the living choose to do. The plague is coming, someday. It always does. And when it does, the only question that has ever mattered will be asked of us, as it was asked of every generation in this story. Not how many will die, but what the survivors will build. Because the dead do not write history, the living do. History was written by the plagues and by the people who outlived them.